I'm involved in a performance of Into the Woods, the musical up in Alexandria. And one of the songs is, I won't do it justice, singing is not my thing. And it's not my song, but it just seems so appropriate. Sometimes people leave you when you're in the wood. Do not let it grieve you. No one leaves for good. You are not alone. No one is alone. And I think about that with the relationship that Quiet Oaks has, not just with the families, but with the residents. And I mentioned before what an impact that was to me when my father was in hospice. And it's the family that can feel alone at that time, and the way that Quiet Oaks staff comes around and surrounds and cares. And it's a touch, it's a word, it's a glance that means everything. It means, I understand. One of the highlights for me each year is having a family member come up and share. And tonight our guest speaker is a woman who was part of Quiet Oaks, the vision and the commitment to this house before it opened, before she earned the title, a family member of one of our residents. In fact, of two. Would you please welcome the lovely, the talented, the passionate Mimi Bitzan.
Good evening, everyone. Eleanor Roosevelt says, do one thing every day that scares you. Well, this is it. I am so honored to share my family's Quiet Oaks story. Each one of our residents and their families has their own Quiet Oaks story. Each story is sacred, and each story has helped shape Quiet Oaks into what it is today. Both of my parents, yeah, there they are, water fight. Both of my parents, Helen and John McGreevy, passed away at Quiet Oaks. My mother died in March of 2010. My dad passed away a year and a half later on Christmas Eve, 2011. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Helen and John and what led them and us to Quiet Oaks. My mother, Helen, was one of St. Cloud's first hospice volunteers. When Quiet Oaks opened its doors, she was so excited to have a residential hospice house in our community. She toured Quiet Oaks, and she often brought homemade cookies to the staff and volunteers. 2 years later, my mother's cancer, which had been in remission, came back with a vengeance. I remember being with her in the room at the St. Cloud Hospital as doctors told her that the cancer had come back. They proposed a number of treatment options, and they waited for her response. She paused briefly, and then she said in a strong voice, "If I have those treatments, will I go back to playing bridge and doing water aerobics?" They said, "No, probably not." "Well then," she said, "we're done. We're done with treatment." But that leaves us with a problem. She looked at the staff and she told them, "My family loves me, but my symptoms are too complex for them to manage at home, so where does that leave us?" I said, "Quiet Oaks, Mom?" "Too darn expensive," she said. She did not say darn. I said they're experts at comfort care and pain management. "We'll go to Quiet Oaks," she said. And my dad drove her there the next day. The staff person who welcomed her took one look at my mother, physically depleted, exhausted. She hadn't been able to keep food down in weeks. "Helen," she said, "the first thing I want when I get home from the hospital is a long, hot shower. Would you like one? I could also wash your hair." She was with my mom for over 45 minutes. And when my mother came back to her room, she was dressed in soft pajamas and she smelled of lavender. We put a quilt over her and she slept soundly for 3 hours. Then she woke up and asked to go to dinner. She ate for the first time in weeks without getting sick. That's comfort care. That's Quiet Oaks. My mom died on March 11th, 2.5 weeks after coming to Quiet Oaks. She died just before dawn in the arms of her granddaughter, our daughter Katie. A little over a year later, my dad had some medical tests and his physician told him there was a shadow in his pancreas. He said it was likely the shadow was cancer. They could do further tests, they could propose treatment. My dad took a deep breath and he said he wasn't going to do those tests. "You know," he said, "I'm 85 years old. I'm just going to get on my surfboard and ride that wave as long as I can." And he did. That summer, we went on bar bingo dates at Shooters. I had never done that before. We watched the twins on TV. He played poker with his buddies, and we had lots of family dinners together. In October, he went back to his place in Fort Myers. My brothers, Dick, and I, and our adult children took turns visiting him often. A few days before Thanksgiving, my dad was on the golf course in Florida giving Katie a golf lesson. I don't have any medical background, none, but I could tell that this shadow was progressing. My dad was jaundiced, and he was weaker. "Dad," I said, "why don't you come home with me?" "Nope," he said, "not ready." So I went home without him. The day after Thanksgiving, 2 days later actually, he called me. "Mimi," he said, "send the boys. I'm coming home." My brothers flew down and brought him home the next day. Simple medical tests showed that the shadow was cancer and it had progressed. My dad spent the next 3 weeks in his St. Cloud home, getting his affairs, which were already in order, even more in order. He and we were assisted by a wonderful hospice team from St. Cloud Hospital Hospice. I usually stayed with him during the days, and my brothers and Dick took turns staying with him at night. He was getting much weaker, and when he got up at night, he refused or forgot to ask for help. And a number of times he came close to having a really bad fall. My brothers and Dick basically slept with one eye open. We suggested that Dad think about going to Quiet Oaks, but he said, "Nope, I'm not sick enough." That week, his hospice nurse visited. We told her about the situation. My dad was resting in his bedroom, but he overheard us. "Nancy, Nurse Nancy," he said, "is that you? Stop fraternizing with the enemy and get in here. You're supposed to be on my side." Nurse Nancy went into the room and shut the door. My brother and I sat on the couch because clearly we're not in charge. After about 20 minutes, Nurse Nancy came out. "John has decided he will go to Quiet Oaks," she said. "John has decided he will go tomorrow." I don't know how she did that. I'm pretty sure she convinced him to do it for us. We had a candlelight dinner in his home that night. Neighbors stopped by to sing carols, and the next day my father walked into Quiet Oaks. You know, as wonderful as Quiet Oaks is, it can take a while to settle in. The TV in his room was definitely not big enough. And honestly, my dad would push his button and then time the nurses to see how fast they would get there. But after a few days, he settled in, and we celebrated his 86th birthday at Quiet Oaks. One of the volunteers made delicious chocolate cake, and my dad opened presents. He loved presents. He was getting weaker, but it was a pretty gentle process. One afternoon, he asked, "Do you really think I'm dying?" And I said, "Yes, Dad, it's gentle, but I think you're making progress." "Well, good," he said. "Well, good, I am ready, so tell your mother to hurry up and send the train." And then he asked me, "Who's going to write my obituary? Are you?" Oh, that didn't anticipate that. I said, "Well, Dad, you know, the boys are great with computers, business, law, finance. I'm probably going to be the one to write it." He said, "Well, go home and do it. I want to see it." I went home and wrote it. He edited it twice. On Christmas Eve morning, we all gathered 5 a.m. My dad was getting really close. We watched and waited and prayed. Around noon, Dick and I went for a walk in the woods. When we came back, I looked at my dad and I said, "Oh my, he's not going to go meet my mother looking like this. He is a handsome guy." And the nurses got it. They shooed us out of the room. And when we came back just minutes later, he was in his good-looking jeans and his navy blue Ralph Lauren sweater, and he looked great. We opened up the window for his spirit to fly. "Dad," we said, "we know Christmas Eve officially starts at 4:30 at the McGreevy house. But you know, you can leave early. Mom could probably use the help." He exhaled and he passed. My mother had sent the train. We went home. The first presents we opened that Christmas Eve were from my dad. Family heirlooms he had chosen and wrapped for each one of us. The journey to the next life is sacred, but it's not always easy. The support and care we received at Quiet Oaks allowed us to learn so much from each of my parents. Mary and Joe, nurses and staff, Dr. Lally, volunteers, benefactors, on behalf of our family, thank you for all you do to support this great treasure, this gift to our community. Thank you.